Good evening, everybody. I realized when I looked at the schedule that I was competing against dance performances and others, so I'm glad that you're here. Thank you very much. So today I'd like to talk about volcanic resources. That's the first part of the talk, and in the second part of the talk I will focus a little more on agriculture and gardening, with particular reference to the Canary Islands and the history that has developed since the 1736 eruption on Lanzarote, our last port of call. And, well, I guess we can start with the reputation that volcanoes generally have, and usually volcanoes have a rather poor reputation. It's often portrayed as a very dangerous thing to live close to a volcano. And just here's some recent images from Etna erupting in February 2021. And of course, it sits right above the city of Catania. And Catania is just here. And you see the lava flows coming down, very similar to the La Palma eruption later last year. And of course, there's a lot of threats to the local population. There's a lot of problems with infrastructure, and this is kind of common in most volcanically active areas that also have a dense population. So this is the same in Hawaii, for instance, or in many other parts of the world. And this is some images from Indonesia, and there is Merapi volcano in the back here, and those Pacific volcanoes, or that cluster around the Pacific, they're even more explosive than those within plates like the Canaries or Hawaii. And here's a little village, the village of Kaliatin, which was entirely overrun by pyroclastic deposits, meaning hot ash clouds and block and ash flows. So you see the blocks and the ash here. And luckily the village was evacuated, so this was the good thing about it. But well, volcanoes have a bad reputation because there's a lot of problems, from these pyroclastic flows, these glowing avalanches, to lava flows, to ash fall. We discussed this in one of the previous lectures. And then there's the secondary effects like lahars, mud flows, and all these things. And this can affect areas only a few hundreds of meters to kilometers away from the volcano, and within hours of the actual event. And it can actually last for days if you think of ashfall that travels for hundreds of kilometers. And ultimately, it can even affect months or years after the eruption, like you may have heard, the year without a summer, 1816, which was a consequence of the Tambora eruption in Indonesia. And apparently it changed world politics because the weather suddenly allowed different maneuvers for certain groups of people, including certain armies. And I'd like to kind of clean up this bad reputation that volcanoes have to a certain degree today. Of course, volcanoes have negative consequences, but volcanoes have two faces. They have two sides, and this is very, very important. We must not forget that. So volcanoes and their underlying magmatic processes are actually the principal agents of redistribution of materials within our planet. Things from deep in the earth are brought up, and there's fluids and magma circulating, and they can concentrate a lot of materials, a lot of elements. So therefore, they are a key feature, these processes, to understand the localized concentrations of metals, minerals, and fluids. And therefore, they're actually crucial for humans, for us dwelling on the surface of the planet. And this is a much more long-term way of looking at things, and this is often ignored, certainly by the media, when it comes to volcanic phenomena. So I'm going to go through a large list of aspects, and I will look a little bit at metals and metal concentrations, gemstones. I will look at making dynamite, and then we look at building materials and industrially important materials. We can have a quick look at geothermal power, and then we're going to look at food, drink, and cosmetics, And I'll plunge right in here. This is one of the big mines in Sweden, and it's an open pit mine. It's very important for copper and iron and other important metals. And Sweden has the largest iron reserves in all of Europe. And it's the #1 producer for iron in the European Union. And here's some of my students, and we are investigating the mine there. And I should point out that these are all old volcanoes. The metal is concentrated by volcanic processes. Of course, these volcanoes are not active. They're long extinct. But the metal concentrations wouldn't be there. And here's a rather beautiful specimen of copper, silver, and gold together, and this formed inside a volcano. So when it comes to metals and gemstones, it's not just iron and copper and lead and silver. It's a lot more, and we can talk a little bit more about this later. The critical elements, as they're currently called, they're also largely volcanic. But when we think about most of the IT applications, most of the hardware, well, we use huge amounts of copper. When we think about large constructions like bridges, we use huge amounts of steel and therefore iron. So these metals are predominantly volcanic in origin, and without them, we would not have the society we have, and we get in contact with these metals almost every day. So when we think about alternative energies, green technology, we also need to think about where to get all these metals from. And we need new metals, not just the standards like iron and copper. We need complicated metals like manganese and rare earth elements, the actinides of the periodic table for those of you who are strongly interested in chemistry. So to make solar panels and wind turbines, we need complicated metal assemblages. And this here is a rock sample from the Canary Islands, but it's from a submarine volcano. And what we have here, this dark crust, is really what we're after now. It's a manganese crust. It has a lot of manganese and cobalt. And cobalt is super important for making batteries. So if you drive an electric car, whatever brand it is, you will have a lot of cobalt in there. At the moment, most cobalt actually comes from Africa, and it's mined under very strange conditions. So the European Union, as well as other countries and organizations, they're looking for alternative ways to source cobalt. And going submarine might be one of the main ways for the future. So this is volcanically produced manganese and cobalt that forms as encrustings on this volcanic lapilli tuff, and this is something we might need to get up. But volcanoes also produce or bring up a lot of gemstones, of course. So here I'm showing you some exciting things, and this is various crown jewels, and well, many of the minerals or the crystals in there, the diamonds here, for instance, they're brought up by volcanoes. So this is very important. Many of the diamonds we have, they come originally from South Africa. Nowadays, they're also quarried in, for instance, Australia and in Siberia. But they come up in these volcanic pipes. We call them diatremes. They're shaped like a champagne glass, and they bring volcanic material from deep inside the earth. And diamonds are just carbon, but they're carbon that were exposed to huge amounts of pressure. And then they become really hard. They build this beautifully hard crystal structure. And if the magma rises up very, very fast, the carbon will not change its form, and it will stay as a diamond. So, and of course, if you kind of polish it and grind it and make it beautiful, it looks like this. But in the field, the geologist will see it in this shape. These are unpolished, uncut diamonds. Now, they can also happen in meteorite impacts, but this is very rare. So the much more easy way to make diamonds is actually via these pipes, these diatremes, the first one being from Kimberley. So they're often also referred to as kimberlite diatremes. So another important aspect that I think we need to point out is that volcanic rock was and still is used as a tool, and it was one of the first tools of mankind. When you think of obsidian, then, well, you can just about realize that this is a volcanic glass, and these rocks were very useful. If they splinter, they make these really sharp edges. And that has been used as a tool. And it's still a very important cutting tool today. Several surgeons I talked to say that cutting with obsidian blades actually has an advantage over using metal blades. The wounds heal better because once the obsidian is polished to the right degree, it actually makes a far cleaner cut. So I was really impressed. And if you think of the Guanches, the original people here on the Canaries, they didn't have metal. When you think of the inhabitants of Hawaii or New Zealand, they didn't have metal either. They had weapons made of obsidian. And here's a primitive knife and, of course, arrow tips and spearheads and things like that. So this was one of our major tools early on in human evolution. And here's a few more examples. And I have a particularly nice specimen that I recovered in northern Denmark. I'm not entirely sure how old it is, but this is a cutting blade. And I think we must realize that this was a process or a feature that was really very common back in the Stone Age and really allowed us to handle materials in a very different way. So I also like to talk a little bit about abrasion materials, and this is volcanic pumice, pumice stone, and it's a volcanic glass with a lot of bubbles. It's a bit fragile at times, but the material in between the bubbles, the white material here, that is actually a form of glass, and therefore it's very hard. It's quite fragile, it breaks easily, but it's very hard, and we can use this to abrade things. And here is industrial abrasion pumice powder, and here is for industry an abrasion stick, and that has pumice in it. But we also find that this is widely used in cosmetical products for exfoliation. So here we have a hand and foot scrub which has pumice stone in here, as you see. And there are several others, volcanic pumice stone, and here is one that even tries to kind of bring in the concept of big volcanic eruptions being good for your personal hygiene. So they named their product Krakatau Body Scrub. Well, the principle underlying these things is the same. There's very hard, small particles in there, and they, of course, are harder than any form of skin, and therefore they will abrade. And this is even used in some of the whitening toothpaste. So here, for example, there is a little bit of pumice in there. So you're putting Volcano in your mouth if you use whitening toothpaste, believe it or not. So, and when I was young, when I was a little boy, blue jeans were blue and dark, and then there was this new fashion coming up that was washed out blue jeans. And they were stone washed at the time. That's what that was the term. And we were all excited as young kids about this and wanted to have stone washed jeans. Only many years later did I realize that the stone for washing stone washed jeans was actually pumice stone. So they're tumbled in a big tumble dryer, if you will, together with pumice stone, and this will abrade the blue jeans, and I will take the color out and, well, rip some pieces. It's not necessarily my fashion style today, but when I was younger, this was attractive, I think. So I should also mention white gold. Porcelain has been a major revolution for us, and most people underappreciate that. Think of some 1,000 years ago, certainly in Europe, we were likely eating off wooden plates, and once you used them a few times, there was all sorts of things, chemical reactions happening within the wood, and not all of them favorable. And in terms of hygiene, the use of porcelain has been tremendously bringing us forward. Initially, this comes from China, and they used volcanic rock, old volcanic rock, in an area called kaolin, and they have been mixing it with quartz and feldspar. Here's a feldspar crystal, And these are from granite. Granite is a volcanic rock that forms in continental areas under volcanoes. So not in oceanic areas, we don't find that particular rock in the Canaries, but we find it in continental areas, like in China, and there the accurate mixture of these components and a burning process allows you to create porcelain, and if you glaze it afterwards, if you reheat it, you can cover them with a very thin coating of glass, and this makes them inert to these chemical reactions that would come from food relicts or things like that. And of course, nowadays, in medical situations, we would use these kind of porcelain applications so that we can clean them off very easily, reuse them, and we don't have to kind of worry about the remnants of any kind of bacteria. Sulfur. Sulfur is very important, and I'd like to say a word about that. To make gunpowder or dynamite, you need charcoal, potassium nitrate, and sulfur. And these days, most of our sulfur is a byproduct of refining petroleum, and it's coming from oil effectively. Now, our plan as a society is to go off fossil fuels, and that means we will actually have a shortage of sulfur in the long run. So this is one of these negative consequences that people are starting to realize now, what will actually be required to go into a fossil fuel-free energy society. And sulfur is going to be one of these problems. And up to about 100 years ago, sulfur was effectively mined in volcanoes. This is a sulfur mine that is still active in Indonesia. And I visited a few years ago. It's horrendous, literally horrendous. I mean, I had full protective gear with gas masks, but most of the workers there, they don't. Still, we must also see the other side. They earn about 5 times more than a rice farmer outside the mine. So there is a reward for these people doing it, although I think a bit more protective support for them would probably be a good thing. But we have mined sulfur in Europe for a long time. Much of the sulfur, for example, the Navy, the British Navy, the Swedish Navy, etc., actually came from Iceland. And it's volcanic sulfur in order to make gunpowder and then conquer whoever you want to conquer, I guess. So, and sulfur is still used in many parts of the world for using, for example, this soap. This allows you to produce cleaner skin, and therefore sulfur has also another purpose there. Now, I'd like to say a few words about geothermal power. And geothermal power is one of these great inventions of the last 50 years. And here we're actually using volcanic heat, and this is something that is coming more and more fashionable. Actually, while we were on Gran Canaria, I met up with a friend from the University of Las Palmas, and we have just secured a little contract with one of the energy companies in Spain to look at the potential of geothermal energy production on the island of island of La Palma. Sorry, I mixed up Las Palmas and La Palma. La Palma, where the recent eruption happened, and there is now a lot of excess volcanic heat, and maybe that can be exploited. So the idea here is that we have a heat source at depth, and we're pumping down cold water, not exactly into the heat source, but close to it, and then the water will either evaporate to steam, it will be converted, or it will heat up depending on what the system is, and then either steam or hot water is brought up, and there we can either use this directly for heating purposes, or we have turbines, and these turbines may then produce electricity. So here's an image from New Zealand. That's the Wairaki power plant, and this is a really advanced system there. And here the volcanic steam is brought up and it's piped into certain areas, ideally into a turbine, and then electricity can be produced from that, requiring no fossil fuels or nuclear power. One problem, and that is the piping will clog up after some time. So this is actually a cut through one of the pipes, and you see after a while the piping has narrowed considerably. And this means that the pipes have to be replaced after a certain time. So this is one of the downsides, so nothing is for free, but this is certainly something that many parts of the world will now develop. And I have talked to a colleague in Indonesia. There's big plans to, for example, build several of these power plants now and therefore reduce the use of fossil fuels in those areas. So here's a Chevron-run geothermal pilot plant that is in Java, Indonesia, and I visited there a few years, and it's actually making a profit, so it's a very good design, and hopefully more of this can be built in the future. So Iceland, believe it or not, Iceland produces a lot of fruit, and yeah, most people are surprised by that, but it's because of the geothermal power. They heat greenhouses with that, and the wastewater from one of those geothermal power plants is actually channeled into a pond, and it's become one of Iceland's biggest tourist attractions. It's the Blue Lagoon down here. So this is actually wastewater from a geothermal plant here on the Reykjanes Peninsula, close to where the eruption happened last year. And the water is still warm, and it's very rich in silica, so it's good for your skin. And here is a little diagram showing how geothermal energy in Iceland is used. Most of it is used for making electricity and for heating spaces, but greenhouses, for example, make a few percent, and swimming pools make another few percent here. So, and if you go to the Blue Lagoon in Iceland, then you can buy all sorts of cosmetical products there. Apparently very popular in Asia, so this is why most of the labels are bigger in certain Asian writing. And here you can take the volcanic mud, if you will, and apply it to your skin, and it's very good for your skin. It cleans the skin, and it has abrasive qualities. So people going to the Blue Lagoon, they may apply then some of these volcanic muds, and then they can be flavored with different things, and then they take different colors, but the original mud is actually just white in color. So, talking about evaporation, and this is some images from the high Andes in in Chile, the high Andes in South America and Chile. And as you probably know, we need a lot of lithium and also a bit of boron for making batteries. And this is one of the main sources for lithium in the future. It's these salars, as they're called, the salt lakes. And here's one of these salt lakes, and there's a few lonely flamingos here. And here you see the lake drying up, if you will, and once the lake is dried up, it's basically a crust of salt that stretches for literally hundreds of kilometers. And this can be quarried, and this contains a lot of lithium. So here we have a natural occurrence, and the lithium comes from the volcanoes. So the water brings it to the lakes, but originally the volcanoes bring it from the depth of the earth. So here, most of the lithium is actually volcanic in origin. And, well, there's discussion about how much lithium we might need in the future. Maybe technology will step forward and less lithium will be needed than we think right now. But the estimates of our requirements for lithium are phenomenal. We probably need 400 times more than we are quarrying right now in order to electrify the traffic. So this is going to be a big challenge, and the volcanoes can hopefully help us with that. So here's a few impressions from those areas. And as I said, when we think about electric cars and batteries, then lithium is vital. Lithium and cobalt are the two critical elements here. So, but volcanic rocks are also useful for dwellings, and those of you who have been listening to Sharon Torres or have been visiting some of the sites in the Canary Islands, you probably saw or heard about some of these dwellings in volcanic rock, and this is from Gran Canaria. This is Cenubio de Valerón. There's different hypotheses about this, how it was actually used. Some people say it was a monastery. Some other people say it was a kind of store for important goods and also for slaves. But the most likely scenario is that this was actually a grain store high up in the mountains because it was dry and it could be easily protected. Whatever the exact reason is, it was exploited by the local people at the time, and these little caves, the little cavernous structures here, they were used to store things and maybe even as dwellings. So here's another place on Gran Canaria. This is the Cave of the Kings, as it's called, and this is one of the nicest ones. There's many smaller ones here, so it's presumed that a local king resided in this one. And here, a close-by cave that is nowadays a restaurant, so you can actually go in there and have a meal in there. It's a cave restaurant, and it's rather nice and cool in summer, actually, and it can be very hot in the Canaries, so I can see that living inside a cave can be attractive. Now, other parts of the world have this phenomenon too. Here's Cappadocia in Turkey, and this is also a very famous site where people have dug caves artificially into soft pumiceous rock, and it allows to create a 3D structure inside the mountain, and people can even kind of walk up and down within these structures, I understand. So, thinking about building with rock, well, we have to first of all realize that many buildings have been put on rock. And here's a few examples. This is in France, Saint-Michel, and here's the Regensburg in Austria, and this is Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. All of these, they sit on volcanic rock, on former volcanic vent fills, and they are very hard. The surrounding rock eventually weathers away, and then you have these areas standing proud, and they make formidable areas to put some important buildings on, even strategically important ones. So, and this is not just a feature in Europe, this is also very common in other parts of the world. Bringing you back to Indonesia here. Here's Merapi volcano, and just at the foot of this volcano is several large temples. Here is Borobudur. This is the largest Buddhist temple in the world. And then there's Prambanan, which is one of the largest Hindu temples in the world. They were all abandoned some almost 1,000 years ago, probably because of a major eruption of the volcano, but they're entirely built of volcanic stone from Mount Merapi. And of course, this is not just something that has been developed at active volcanoes. This is also something that the Romans have already exploited. They brought rocks from a little further away to, for example, Rome. When you think of various important buildings like the Pantheon in Rome, it's built of volcanic stone. You can see the pumice structures even in the big blocks of rock that were used here. And the Romans were so clever, they even ground it up and made a form of cement, the pozzolana cement, allowing them to build aqueducts and roads and all these amazing things. Now, if you think to the Canaries and a little bit further in time, the colonial Spanish period, well, this is Arico Church in Tenerife, and here we have a Spanish colonial building, and this is, of course, made of volcanic stone. And I visited the quarry, and yeah, it's still quarried today. In fact, the stone is very good, and many buildings in Santa Cruz actually have this as a cladding stone to this day. So, volcanic rocks make fine building stone. Basalt is very solid, and pumiceous rock or tuff is a very good insulator because of the porosity. So, depending on what type of structure you want to build, volcanic stone has been very useful. Another important application is milling stones, and here volcanic stone is very good because it's very hard and it allows to grind down all sorts of cereal, and this has been used for a long time. The problem, of course, is you might get tiny flakes of glass, of volcanic glass in your flour, and simple applications are often having a long-term effect. If you think about the teeth of the local population, of the Aboriginal population in the Canaries, they were usually rather ground down. So there's a long-term negative effect, despite the fact that initially when you grind it, it's very effective. So, but volcanic stone is still widely used today, and here we have a selection of various, let's see, here we have a selection in the bottom right of various volcanic stones that are used, and the stone is very good. You can clean it easily, and it's very solid, it's very sturdy. So, and when you think of building houses, volcanic rock is also very important. Here is a sand quarry in Indonesia, and they're quarrying it purposefully in a random fashion, because when the next glowing avalanche comes, it will be slowed down because of these ripples they create, and the sand is used for making cement. And when you think of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria, there is about 30 to 40% of all of this material here is actually volcanic pebbles that have been mixed into the cement. So now I'd like to come to the last part of the talk, and I'd like to spend a little bit more time on that, and that is the use of volcanic rocks in agriculture and gardening. So we talked about primitive housing, concrete supplements, abrasives, but I really like to focus on this a little more. So let's look at this. Volcanic particles and volcanic soils are extremely fertile, and this is exploited in many parts of the world. You can grow wine at Etna or in the Auvergne in France, which is a volcanic area, or these ones here, these wines from Gran Canaria. And let me go back to Indonesia for a minute. Indonesia has volcanoes, and it's got a lot of rainfall, it's tropical, and therefore it's got all the things that are needed. It's got the volcanic soil and the water to grow things. So here's a little thunderstorm in Indonesia, and you see there's a lot of water there. And it allows to grow all these amazing things. For good reason, these areas were the spice islands of the past, because you can grow chili peppers and all these kind of things. And they grow because there's water, there's warm climate, and volcanic soil. Let me point out that coffee is done in the same way. 70% of all coffee is grown on volcanic soil. So when you drink coffee in the morning, most probably your coffee has touched volcano at some point. And here's a map of domestic coffee consumption. And where I come from, Northern Europe, here Sweden, we drink a lot of coffee, probably because of the lack of sunshine. And further south, coffee is less intensely consumed. But here in the north, coffee is really, really popular. And this means we're bringing the coffee from warm volcanic areas, we're importing it to the colder areas on the planet. So here's a few insights from a coffee plantation in East Java that I visited a little while ago. So here they use these larger trees in order to give shade to the coffee plants, and here you have some berries. And eventually they are collected and they are sorted, and here's the beans, and they're actually white, they're dried, and then they're roasted, which gives you then the final product, ground or not. Many people prefer to grind the coffee themselves these days, but that's the process. Now, chocolate is also often grown on volcanic soil. Here's some cocoa beans that come from Indonesia. This is actually at the slopes of Merapi volcano as well. They grow really well there. And some companies exploit that. The most famous chocolate bar in Iceland is actually called Lava, and it hints at this connection to volcanic soils, and several other brands are exploiting this as well, but I don't think the connection between chocolate and volcanoes is all that well known. Tea is very similar. A lot of tea is actually grown on volcanic soil. Tea needs high altitude, and it needs a certain level of moisture, but it also needs very fertile soil, which is often given at volcanoes. So here I've got a very special plant for you, and this is also a big cash crop, although not everybody has seen it in this shape. Many people are not quite sure. When I ask my students, what do you think that plant is, then most people struggle with this. So this is when it's young as seedlings, this is when it's flowering, and this is when it's getting more mature. And this is what we do with this. This is tobacco. And tobacco has been grown on La Palma, for example, for a long time. Winston Churchill smoked La Palma cigars. But these days, smoking is less fashionable. But tobacco is still important because we use nicotine, for example, as a pesticide, as a natural pesticide. And it's partly also used as a fertilizer for certain things. So we still need tobacco. And even though we don't smoke it quite so much anymore as a society, but tobacco is still grown in many parts of the world, and volcanic soil is very good for it. So now we've talked about the combination of a moist, humid climate and volcanoes, and that's all good and well, but in the Canaries often we have the volcano part, but we don't have a lot of water here. So this makes it a little difficult. The little volcanic stones, they're called picon locally, and this is something that is produced during volcanic eruptions, like here, 1971 on La Palma, and these are the deposits, and this is what you can do with it. You can grow things in them. So this is widely used, not just as a building supplement, but also as an agricultural supplement. And I'd like to explore this a little bit. Now, as I said, when you're in the dry areas, here's the Sahara, the Canary Islands are just about here. This is more difficult. In Indonesia, there's a lot of water. There's a tropical climate. Here, we're in the dry areas. So what we have here is the volcanic stones, but very little water. And it all started on Lanzarote. Lanzarote is beautiful, but it has very little water. This is a tiny little coastal lagoon, but as soon as you go inland, this is the Timanfaya National Park, there's very little water. It's super dry there. But in 1730, a big eruption happened on Lanzarote. It started with big earthquakes, and after a while, the eruption started in mid-1730, and the Spanish king was very concerned, and he sent one of his best men, and this was Bishop Davila. And he was sent to observe the situation. So the bishop arrived, and he was very concerned about the population. He initiated evacuations, and many of the people were sent to the neighboring islands without volcanic eruptions, and most of the villages concerned were evacuated within a year, and the bishop was staying on the island, continuing his observations. Here's an old oil painting of what happened. This is the outline of Lanzarote, and there's a record of where the vents opened up, and this shows which of the vents were active at what point. So we have a great record from these old notes that were made at the time. And there was one fundamental observation by the bishop. He realized when there's thick ash cover, the plants die. But when there's a thin ash cover, the plants start to bloom. And this was fundamental. So the eruption actually lasted 6 years, and 23% of Lanzarote was covered with lava and ash. But after the eruption, the villagers returned, and the bishop recommended that they use little volcanic particles to fertilize their fields. And this has led to a revolution. And you've probably seen it if you have taken a day trip. There's this area here, La Guerilla, and this is where volcanic particles are brought out into the fields, and it allows them there to actually grow all sorts of things. Prior to that, only cereal was possible. After the 1736 eruption, suddenly wine was possible, fruit was possible. So there's something secret about volcanic particles in agriculture. And now these round little walls here, I should point out, they are there to protect the plants from the wind. They don't help the plants grow, they're just protection. But the volcanic particles that are put on the soil, they do miracles for the plants. So here's a few more impressions, and all sorts of plants can be grown. Here's a fresh field to be planted, and here is a lot of grapes being grown to make wine. And you see, there's large areas that are worked in this way these days, and the entire valley here is full with these kind of little depressions into which the plants are set, and it allows to make superb wine. So here you can see this valley here, it's filled up with artificial black volcanic particles, or this one here, the entire flanks of the valley are full with it. So what happened on Lanzarote was the population doubled within a few decades after that, because suddenly it could sustain a much larger population density. And it led to the wines from Lanzarote being quite famous. And at the Vienna Congress in 1816, actually Lanzarote wine was on the menu. It was considered one of the finest, but later there was a pest and the wines died. But Lanzarote wine is coming back right now, and maybe some of you had a chance to test some Lanzarote wine when we were on the island. So there is a price to be paid, and that is you have to quarry these particles, and it leaves some scars in the landscape. So here's an old quarry, here's an active quarry, and for the geoscientists, this is ugly. So you can see that the volcanic landforms are not pristine, but this is the price that needs to be paid. And here's a large industrial quarry on Gran Canaria, where the lapilli, the little picon material, is quarried. And here you have picon hydroponico, if you can just about read it. It's the one for gardening. Picon normal is for agriculture. And then it's put on lorries and it's brought out to the fields. And it produces these scars here. These are old quarry sites here, still an active one. And this was quarried. It's now no longer allowed to quarry these two places. They are now protected areas. But the damage is partly done, and I'll take you to this site here now. So this is a photo I retrieved from the archives in Las Palmas, and this was the volcanic cone in 1906, and this is the volcanic cone today, and this is me visiting with some of my students, and there's an open site now. Now, for geologists, this is not completely bad, because you can kind of look inside the volcano, but pretty, no. So, and a few words now about the other islands, and Tenerife has a lot of lapilli as well, these picon particles. This is an image of the 1798 eruption, which happened in this area here, and there's volcanic vents all along the different axes, and in the lower part of the island, it's very fertile. So there, the soils are supplemented with these particles, allowing to grow bananas and, of course, wine. So here's a few of those alignments of cones. This is from this area down here, and these can be quarried, and the particles can be used for that. In some areas, pumice stone is more pronounced than the basaltic particles, the dark particles. So locally, pumice stone is used for the same purpose, and here you see quarries in pumice stone, and the pumice stone is used to make these terraces. This is a very peculiar site on Tenerife. This is one volcanic cone, and it has multiple quarries in there. And I was very confused when I saw this the first time, so I investigated. It turned out that the volcano was owned in slices by different people, and each of them made their own quarry. So, yeah, what can you say? That's economy for you. So, therefore, there is now a star-shaped volcano with quarries there on Tenerife. So, I mentioned this before, the quarrying is very intense, and when Humboldt went to Tenerife in 1799, he described 3 cones inside the beautiful Orotava Valley. Today we only see 1.5. Here's one, and this is half. It was partly quarried. There's a hotel here, and there's a little church bell tower here. The other one, the third one, is gone, and it's been completely dug away. So, a few words about La Palma Island, the island with the most frequent eruptions in historical times. And here's a few impressions. This is from the 1971 eruption. And here you see how these volcanic particles are formed. They're blown out of the vents and they pile up. They're quite loose, so it's easy to quarry them. And here we have the vent alignment on top of the island. This is this area here, the Cumbre Vieja, and it's basically big piles of volcanic particles, and you can quarry them. And here we have the Cumbre Vieja, and there's lava that comes down all the way, and it makes these platforms. And what the local people do is they take the volcanic particles from here and they move them onto the new lava platforms, and they put greenhouses on top. So the 1949 lava platform, not even 100 years old, it's full with greenhouses and fields because it's warm and they have the volcanic soil. So coastal platforms are fantastic for this. This is an image from 1949 when the platform formed. This is today, and it's full of greenhouses and fields. And this is the same for the 1585 platform, the 1712 platform, etc., etc. And many of the local people now on La Palma want the new lava platform from 2021 to become fields as well, to bring more money to the island. But the government is a bit reluctant, so there's a bit of a dispute going on right now. We will have to see what happens there. So this is what I pointed out. This is these platforms here in the lower part, and you can see how green they are. And this is where a lot of agriculture happens, and the volcanic material is basically brought from here, and it's put onto here, and it allows the agriculture to flourish. So what is the power of Picon? What is the power of these volcanic particles? Well, it has to do with the moisture to a large degree, and Humboldt described this first in 1799. What we have in the Canaries is these cloud formations, the sea of clouds. There's not a lot of rainfall here, but there's these clouds, and they cause dew, particularly early in the morning and at certain times of the year, and this is part of the secret here. So this is going back to Humboldt. It's very fertile in the lower parts of the islands, and it gets less fertile higher up. We have this arrangement of trees a little bit into the middle altitude of the island, and here we have to think about that. It's the precipitation from these clouds, it's not rainfall directly, that allows to do these things. And the Corona Forestal is a stretch of forest, of pine forest. Here's an example of it in this altitude level, about 1,000 meters to about 2,000 meters above sea level, and this is where the sea of clouds comes in. And the pines here, they catch the moisture from the clouds, and this is something that the particles, the Picon, can do as well. So this goes back to this kind of little story about the holy tree on El Hierro, the Garahoy. And when the Spaniards came to conquer the island, they pushed the local inhabitants into the mountains, into the dry mountains. They believed that the locals will basically die of thirst in the mountains. But the locals had a secret. It was this tree here, the Garahoy tree. And the Garahoy was catching moisture from the clouds, and the water was dripping down, and they had a little pond there where they collected it, and it allowed them to drink. And the locals survived for many years up in the mountains, unknown to the Spanish conquerors, who were mainly at the base level of the island. And this was a hotel room I stayed in for a little while during some field work a few years ago. And one afternoon we got a delivery of pecan for gardening. And the next morning I looked at it, and you could see all the water that has come out of the particles. It looked entirely dry when it was delivered. So these particles, they store a lot of moisture. And that's the trick. They can suck up the moisture from the clouds, and they store the moisture in the little bubbles inside these particles. And I had a student investigating this a little bit further. This is some images with the electron microscope. Here, this is 1 micrometer. It's super tiny, and here's one of those little bubbles. And what we found in there is microorganisms. So not only is there water in there, there's actually life in these volcanic particles. And this life sustains itself from breaking down the volcanic rock. And it eats all sorts of things, sulfur, I guess, and etc. And this brings more carbon to the soil. So there is not just water being stored, there's actually more life in the soil, and living soil is good for plants. So here's a few more examples. I don't want to go into the details, they're all listed here, and there is a few handouts over there of various articles if you're interested. Please feel free to take some. There we talk in detail about what kind of organisms live there, and here the important thing is that the rocks bring all these nutrients and they bring living soil, and this is really good. That's the secret of the volcanic particles, and this is why agriculture has profited so much from that. Now, a little outlook just at the very end, and this is that we all know we have these problems. We have too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and there is big imbalances, and here's just a little diagram, and here is one of the important things. Volcanic particles that have microorganisms in them, they will actually bind CO2. So there's the opportunity for us to reshift this balance a little bit, and it's been estimated that we could potentially reduce our CO2 emissions by something like 20% if we were to use volcanic particles more widely. So this is an estimate of how much we could potentially keep in the ground, and these numbers could be discussed. I don't know how good they are, but this is done for different countries, and it ranges from 5% to maybe 20%. But here we have a cheap way, without a lot of fuss, to potentially lock a lot of CO2 in the ground and produce more crops and therefore feed more people. So this might allow us to make a huge difference, and here in these dry areas, particularly in the Sahara and the Canary Islands, it worked really well. And therefore, I think we could potentially think about making those areas here, the really dry ones, green in the future. Thank you very much.